There is the question of the media's responsibility in reporting on AIDS and AIDS in Africa in particular. Why hasn't the media been more skeptical? Why hasn't the media been more critical about the kinds of things I'm talking about? I'm not exactly sure. I don't know whether members of the media believe that if someone is wearing a white jacket and has the letters MD after their name, that they are to be deferred to in a way that the media would never do to a brigadier general, for example, or to someone in any number of other fields, say in economics, housing development, lending, or a military kind of occupation somewhere in the world. But with AIDS, I find that the media over the last 25 years has been very complicit and very lazy. I think, in fact, the media bears a big piece of the responsibility for not being more critical because they basically have repeated what was given to them by the AIDS orthodoxy. Trying to read through these highly technical articles in the British Medical Journal or Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, for example, or the Journal of the American Medical Association, is not easy going for journalists. So many journalists that have covered AIDS since 1981, I have found tend to simply regurgitate the press releases that accompany the finding of a new study in one of these deeply academic and scholarly journals. Every one of these large institutions that produces these research results will give out to the media press releases. I've seen the press releases, and there is a close correlation between what the press release says and what the media repeats. And so there's a kind of absence of skepticism, an absence of critical thinking, which in part has explained how AIDS has been able to be interpreted only one single way, which is it's caused by a virus. Sexual behavior is at the root of it. Changing your sexual behavior is what will make you free of AIDS. The media also, it seems to me, doesn't want to shake the boat because I think too many members of the media, like Mark Schutz, for example, of Village Voice, Laurie Garrett, for example, of Newsday, they've won prizes for their reporting, Pulitzer Prizes for their reporting about AIDS in Africa. When I've grilled those people one-on-one with a tape recorder transcribing or keeping tabs on what the interview says, I'm shocked at how absolutely innocent, non-critical, and almost like a supplicant they are to the mainstream view about AIDS in Africa. I don't know whether it's because the media doesn't take, or members of the media don't take the trouble to familiarize themselves with the weaknesses, the flaws, the inconsistencies, the errant projections and predictions that are made by the AIDS establishment, or whether it's something else. I really don't have a good understanding there. But there are members of the media who have asked those questions. There are people like John Cruzden, for example, from the Chicago Tribune. There was Eleanor Burkett from the Miami Herald. There are other independent journalists like Celia Farber, for example, with her article in Harper's in March of 2006. They've asked those hard questions. Invariably, the weight of thousands of AIDS researchers comes down on their head. And it is not a very good feeling. I mean, they don't necessarily have any tougher skins than the rest of us. So I think the AIDS establishment has certainly worked very hard to create a consensus that most members of the media are unwilling to challenge. Simple as that. Why don't more people adopt a critical stance towards this received wisdom? It can't stop just with AIDS. It could stop with any number of other topics. But I think with AIDS, once again, we've got 25 years of a so-called epidemic. We've got 25 years of unlimited money being spent on AIDS, and yet there is absolutely nothing serious to show for it. I've often asked people in South Africa who are AIDS researchers to show me a project that had a needs assessment attached to it, a budget, a set of goals. Show me a project that actually achieved what it was designed to achieve. And they cannot come up with anything. It's almost like this is a self-licking ice cream cone, something which perpetuates itself. It's not supposed to have an ending. It just is supposed to keep going. And so to ask hard questions, like we're trying to do here, is to threaten the integrity and the future of a large body of researchers and members of the media, and that cannot be allowed. I suppose if I were to recommend to my students or to members of the public or to the media where to go, what to think about again, I would ask them to revisit the state of affairs in Africa in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Put into a context where the so-called AIDS epidemic came from. I would urge people to read any number of solid studies on the political economy, the breakdown of the political economy in Africa, the decline in prices for agricultural exports, the rising number of civil disturbances and civil wars in Africa, the severe restrictions put on lending for basic services in Africa by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I think you could find a series of historical and economic indicators which would clearly show you why you don't need to bring in any reference to the rainforest, to prostitutes' behavior, to truck drivers, and other kinds of fanciful tales from the equator to understand why the lives of Africans began to steadily deteriorate in the 1980s. My cure for this orthodox view of AIDS in Africa is the old-fashioned way, really, and that is to go and do some reading. Go and do some critical reading about African history, about African culture, about African political economies. If you do that, you will see where education, second thoughts, careful reasoning, logic, those kinds of things are the skills one really needs to have to at least raise doubts, to encourage skepticism, and to think anew about what really is making Africans sick. I've said it many times in my writings, but the cure for AIDS in Africa is as near at hand as an alternative hypothesis as to what is making Africans sick in the first place. And that is what I strongly recommend people do before giving any more money to these AIDS organizations. I think members of the public often notice the celebrities like Elizabeth Taylor and Tom Cruise and Bono, who have suddenly and inexplicably become experts on public health. I'm no expert on music. I don't think the public ought to take me seriously if I talk about music or about acting or about Hollywood. I don't believe, or I don't think that the public in this country should take Elizabeth Taylor or Madonna or Cher or Tom Cruise or Bono seriously about anything outside of the entertainment industry. Unfortunately, we have turned these kinds of stars into authorities on things way beyond their own training and their own knowledge. And so my best advice to them would be, of course, stick to what you know about and leave these other things to scientists, public health people, scholars, critical journalists, and people who have actually immersed themselves in the literature, not simply read the press releases. The question often comes up, what has been the benefit of all of the billions and billions of dollars that are spent so-called fighting AIDS in Africa, and couldn't that money be spent someplace else? The short answer is, of course, that the money could have been spent more effectively and in a more basic way anywhere else. The reason, or a reason theoretically, why that money doesn't get spent there is that, once again, this has become a calling. This has become a kind of endeavor fighting AIDS, in which people who believe in what they're doing cannot, in good conscience, hold a contrary thought. It's what psychologists call the mentality of taboo. Holding a critical thought, if you are in the AIDS orthodoxy, is against the rules. It's a taboo because it means, or it suggests to mean, that you are turning your back on the people that you are supposed to be helping. So the main critics of the AIDS orthodoxy have come from scientists or scholars like myself or activists who are not beholden to the catechism. We are not beholden to Big Pharma. We are not beholden to this theory. We stand outside and, like scientists are supposed to do, we ask tough questions. And do we get answers to our questions? Absolutely not. We get references to websites. If you pose basic questions, you will be vilified. You will be demonized, as Thabo Mbeki found out. So the theoretical answer is that so much is at stake. So many reputations, social status, so much money is riding on this HIV equals AIDS hypothesis that it is literally impossible for the members of the orthodoxy to step forward and say, we got it all wrong. They can't say that. The only thing they can say is, it's more complicated than we thought. And so I am often fond of saying in my training as a historian that the role of the historian is to reduce the number of untruths. That's what I try to do about this terrifying hypothesis about what's making Africans sick, is to reduce the number of untruths being said about it. And as others have said, we will never cure AIDS until we first cure the research. I don't know if it's possible for the people who do the research about AIDS to ever step back and say what has to be said, which is, we made a big mistake. I think that would really undermine the public's appreciation and support for large laboratory science and for university science. And if I were in their position, I would not want to have to answer to people like Gary Null, or to myself for that matter.